Please welcome the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for Cancer Research, Dr. Margaret Foti.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the American Association for Cancer Research, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Marge Foti, and I have the honor of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the AACR. The AACR is the world's first and largest professional organization dedicated to advancing cancer research and its mission to prevent and cure all cancers. Over the years, the AACR and its more than 47,000 members in the United States and 126 other countries around the world have been at the forefront of every breakthrough against cancer. We marshal the full spectrum of expertise in cancer research to identify the top scientific priorities, convene conferences and educational workshops all over the world, publish 9 high-impact peer-reviewed scientific journals, produce a magazine for cancer survivors, patients, and their caregivers, and work to raise funds from the philanthropic community for highly meritorious cancer research. The AACR also actively communicates with legislators, other policymakers, and the public about the enormous value of cancer research and the serious need for increased investment in cancer science and medicine to save more lives from cancer. A cornerstone of the AACR's communications to Congress and the public is our annual Cancer Progress Report, and we are extraordinarily proud to share the 10th edition of this important publication with you today. First, I'd like to just take a moment to recognize and thank the AACR's distinguished president, Dr. Anthony Ribas, for his leadership role in the development of this 2020 report, the Cancer Progress Report Steering Committee, and everyone on our staff who has been involved during the past year in this project. Special recognition goes to Dr. Raj Sengupta, Senior Editor and Scientific Advisor for the Cancer Progress Report, and lead scientific writer, Dr. Karen Honey. I'd also like to recognize John Ratzlaff, Chief Policy Officer, and his staff in our DC office for their expert guidance with the Call to Action section that emphasizes the vital importance of cancer research in accelerating progress against cancer. I would also like to extend our appreciation to our meetings, marketing and creative services, communications and public relations, and IT departments for their impressive work on behalf of the development of this report and also in transforming this congressional briefing from an in-person event to a virtual event. I would like now to share with you a video that captures many of the highlights of the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2020.
Cami was 4 when she was diagnosed with her brain tumors.
She had 3 to 6 months to live. Camden had a very, very particular mutation in her tumors. Dr. Giles Robinson at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital said for the first time in human history, they thought that they might have a medicine that could help with exactly what she had. A test came back. Our head oncologist was pretty surprised. He used the word miracle. There are countless people with stories just like ours. We would ask and be very grateful for the support and advocacy and funding going forward.
I had a less than 10% chance of surviving. At that point, when my physician and I started talking about clinical trials, I was all in. I have been cancer-free for 4.5 years. I was at the right intersection at the right time of the clinical trial, its availability at Dana-Farber with an oncologist that does research.
At the end of the 1990s, I trained as a medical oncologist. At that time, most patients were treated with either surgery, radiation therapy, or chemotherapy. That made progress and cured some patients, but the great majority of patients with metastatic cancers did not have curative treatment options. That has all been revolutionized by the application of science into cancer treatment.
It starts back in 2005. I noticed a lump in my neck, and it turned out to be non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I had lost about 40 pounds. I was very sick. I spent 18 to 19 hours a day in bed, and with so little hope on the horizon, we decided to ask our kids to come home and have the chance to say goodbye. And it was in the spring of 2011, ipilimumab was released by the FDA. A few weeks later began treatments. Just around the second dose, something changed. The amount of fluid we could take off to the lungs every day started going down for the first time. A week and a half later, I'm getting better. I'm not going to die. It's now been 9 years and there's no sign of disease.
The COVID-19 pandemic has had an obvious large impact on all fields of life, including cancer research. Cancer did not disappear during this time. Patients with cancer needed to be treated.
The impact of the coronavirus is that having to do video calls with my oncologist so I wouldn't have to go in.
I have had my medication sent by courier to me. It hasn't been too tough, so I'm very thankful.
At this time, it's of particular importance to advocate for funding cancer research. The AACR has advocated to get the stimulus support for the National Institute of Health and for the National Cancer Institute.
There's nothing more important than for Congress to continue to fund to the greatest extent possible all of these efforts, because so many strides have been made. I myself have gone through 5 different cancers.
I would like to say to Congress that if we're to be the country that we would like to be, then find the funds to do the research.
Having a cancer diagnosis is devastating. The first thing I thought about was, what will happen to my daughter? She was 7.5 at the time. If there was more research and we could save more lives, I think it would make a significant impact on not just the families who are directly affected, but Americans and society as a whole.
The AACR has been capturing the most important advances on cancer diagnosis, research, and treatment. The investment in science reverts into benefit for patients.
Cancer touches us all, either directly or indirectly, through the diagnoses of cancer in our family members and loved ones. However, it is very heartwarming to note the rapid pace and broad scope of the progress that we are making against cancer. It is truly extraordinary. Unfortunately, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has created significant challenges across the continuum of cancer science and medicine. Laboratory science and clinical research have been seriously disrupted, and cancer care was delayed because resources needed to be reallocated to address the global health crisis. There is now concern that delays caused by COVID-19 in screening and cancer care will have significant negative effects on outcomes for cancer patients. There is a particular concern for racial and ethnic minorities and other underserved populations, because these groups are already experiencing a disproportionate burden of cancer and are now shouldering a higher burden of COVID-19. Further, the disparities in COVID-19 and the recently witnessed racial injustices have refocused our nation's attention on the stark inequities in health care. The AACR is working on various initiatives to eliminate racial inequalities in cancer research and on racial inequity in all of its forms. Going forward, it will be critical that all stakeholders work together synergistically to eradicate the social injustices that are barriers to health equity. Cancer researchers are uniquely positioned to address the challenges posed by the pandemic, and they have been playing a pivotal role in the development of diagnostics, preventive interventions, and treatments against COVID-19. Clinical trials that are simultaneously testing multiple therapies at dozens of medical centers were pioneered by cancer researchers. In fact, this laid the groundwork for adaptive clinical trials within the NIH's active initiative to repurpose existing therapies to treat COVID-19. Furthermore, to overcome the disruption in the conduct of clinical research caused by COVID-19, cancer researchers are working together with all stakeholders to adapt clinical trial practices to ensure that both ongoing and new clinical trials are able to continue safely. Many of these adjustments to cancer clinical trial practice have the potential to lead to long-term positive change for the benefit of patients. The good news is that despite the challenges of the pandemic, in the past year, cancer research has delivered a record number of scientific advances to cancer patients in the form of new treatments for their disease types. Many of these new treatments are strengthening the two newest pillars of cancer care, molecularly targeted therapy and immunotherapy. Indeed, the remarkable advances in cancer science and medicine that will be discussed today would not have been possible without generous federal funding for the National Institutes of Health and the National Cancer Institute. Also, the progress that is bringing hope to patients depends on consistent and significant funding for the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Just as importantly, efforts to expedite the delivery of new therapies to the clinic are dependent on the involvement of patients and cancer survivors in the medical research enterprise, including their willingness to participate in clinical trials, to share their health information and tissue samples, and to advocate alongside the AACR for increased funding for cancer research, along with effective policy changes to maximize future advances against this complex disease. The AACR is especially grateful to the individuals and their loved ones who have generously shared their experience with cancer in this year's AACR Cancer Progress Report. Their personal stories put a face on the challenges and the triumphs experienced every day by cancer survivors throughout this country and the world. One of the cancer survivors featured in the report is on the panel this afternoon, Dr. Albert Stroberg. Our other panelist, Catherine Green, will be speaking on behalf of her daughter, Cami, who is also featured in the report. In addition, I would like to recognize the other individuals and their loved ones who are featured in the report. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Congresswoman Lucy McBath and Congressman Peter King, both of whom shared their unique perspectives on cancer in this year's report. Fortunately, in this era of transformative science, our dedicated cancer researchers have the scientific knowledge, the availability of cutting-edge technologies, and the hard work and passion to deliver unprecedented research advances to patients with cancer. And we have bipartisan leadership in Congress, which has delivered 5 consecutive years of significant annual funding increases for the NIH. This generous federal funding will help us to rapidly exploit today's extraordinary scientific opportunities and markedly reduce cancer incidence, morbidity, and mortality. We especially thank Senator Shelby, Senator Blunt, Senator Murray, Congresswoman Lowy, Congresswoman DeLauro, Congressman Cole, and their colleagues for their extraordinary bipartisan efforts on behalf of all Americans who are touched by cancer. Thanks to their shared vision and commitment to appropriations for medical research, the NIH budget has grown by an amazing $11.6 billion, or 39%, since fiscal year 2015. We urge Congress to complete the fiscal year 2021 funding process in a timely manner, with another substantial budget increase for the NIH. We also ask that Congress include significant funding for the NIH in the next COVID-19 emergency supplemental funding package. By providing generous funding for fiscal year 2021, Congress will help us continue to markedly improve cancer care, increase survivorship among patients who have been diagnosed with cancer, spur economic growth in the U.S., and maintain the United States' position as the global leader in science and medical research. The AACR is committed to working with Congress and other stakeholders who are dedicated to reducing cancer incidence and mortality. By working together, we will be in a better position to accelerate the pace of progress and make major strides toward the goal of preventing and curing all cancers at the earliest possible time. It is now my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, the esteemed president of the AACR, Dr. Anthony Ribas. Dr. Ribas is professor of medicine, surgery, and molecular and medical pharmacology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He serves as director of the Tumor Immunology Program at the Johnson Comprehensive Cancer Center and director of the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy Center at UCLA. Dr. Ribas is a world-renowned physician-scientist whose research has centered on the use of immunotherapy to treat melanoma, the deadliest form of skin cancer. He led the clinical program that demonstrated the effectiveness of pembrolizumab or Keytruda, which has been shown to be a significant advancement in the treatment of melanoma. Dr. Ribas is the recipient of numerous awards, most recently the 2020 European Society of Medical Oncology Award for Translational Research. He is a recipient of the AACR Richard and Hinda Rosenthal Award, the Gruber Memorial Cancer Research Award, the Giants of Cancer Award, and the R35 Outstanding Research Award from the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Ribas has taken the lead on the issue of racism in cancer research. He led a panel discussion titled Racism and Racial Inequities in Cancer Research during AACR's virtual annual meeting 2 in July. The panel was convened to stimulate an open and frank discussion about this issue because of the recent social unrest in our nation and around the world. He stated that the scientific community has, quote, kept quiet for way too long because it was too difficult or too painful to talk about the issue. We are grateful for Dr. Ribas's remarkable leadership on this issue and on so many other topics of importance in the cancer field. Please welcome Dr. Ribas.
Thank you, Marge. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am delighted to be here to discuss the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2020, which details how medical research, much of which is supported by federal investments in the National Institutes of Health, is powering unprecedented progress against the collection of devastating diseases we call cancer. This progress is illustrated by the fact that the number of cancer survivors living in the United States has reached a record high of more than 16.9 million. In addition, overall U.S. cancer death rate fell by 29% from 1991 to 2017, which equates to 2.9 million lives saved. Another way to measure progress against cancer is to consider the number of anti-cancer therapeutics that are approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration over a defined period of time. By this measure, the 12-month period covered by the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2020 was the most successful of any of the periods covered by the 10 editions of the Cancer Progress Report published thus far. There were 20 new therapeutics approved by the FDA for treating patients with various types of cancer, approved during the 12 months covered by this report. During this period, the FDA also expanded the use of 15 previously approved therapeutics to include the treatment of additional types of cancer. Innovative therapeutics highlighted in the Cancer Progress Report 2020 and in the past 9 editions are now bringing life-saving treatment options for many patients with cancer. As an example from my own practice, 10 years ago, only 1 in 20 patients with metastatic melanoma derived benefit from the existing treatments, while now half of patients with this cancer are being effectively treated for long term. The development of new cancer treatments and other medical products used in cancer care is made possible because of the tireless work of individuals across the spectrum of cancer research, from basic, translational, and clinical research. The year 2020, however, will be inextricably linked to the COVID-19, the disease that has taken over 200,000 lives in the US and nearly 1 million worldwide. The pandemic has also disrupted cancer research and care, causing concerns that delays in screening, diagnosis, and treatment will cause thousands of additional deaths from cancer in the future. Cancer researchers are uniquely positioned to respond to many of the challenges posed by COVID-19 and are contributing in numerous ways to address this ongoing public health crisis. In fact, to aid in the global COVID-19 response, the AACR convened a COVID-19 and cancer task force earlier this year. The task force is providing leadership and insights to the AACR on issues surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on high-impact initiatives. Despite the negative impacts of COVID-19 upon societies and patients with cancer, the pandemic has actually hastened some innovative changes to cancer care that are transforming patient access to treatments and clinical trials. Some of these advances include implementation of telehealth, remote consenting for clinical trials, and access to home infusions. As we look to the day when we will be past the COVID-19 crisis, we hope that these advances will continue to support the innovative cancer science that is continuing to lay the foundation of progress against cancer. Therefore, my remaining remarks will discuss how basic science in cancer genomics and immunology has fueled advances in the development of novel cancer therapeutics. In addition, I will also touch upon the new wave of technologies that are paving the way for the next breakthroughs in cancer science and medicine. And before closing, I will point out some of the ongoing challenges that we still face. Over the past decade, work in cancer genomics research has fueled a revolution in our understanding of cancer as a disease of the genome. Such efforts have allowed us to comprehensively catalog the breadth of genetic alterations that are the main drivers of cancer initiation and progression. These discovery efforts have been coincident with the development of target therapies that address the cancer genetic vulnerabilities, heralding a new era of precision medicine that links together the genomic profile of each cancer with a specific drug. Because cancer genomics research and other fields of basic science are continuing to expand our understanding of cancer, we're developing molecular target therapeutics at an extraordinarily rapid rate, as discussed in the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2020. You will hear more about these therapeutics and how they are transforming the lives of patients in a moment from Dr. Susan Cohen. In the same way that cancer genomics research has driven the emergence of molecular target therapy, scientific discoveries in the field of cancer immunology have led to an exciting new pillar of treatment called cancer immunotherapy. Immunotherapies unleash the power of the patient's own immune system to eliminate cancer, much as it fights infections like the flu or sore throat. Over the past decade, the use of immunotherapy has revolutionized the treatment of an increasingly broad array of cancer types. One of the most exciting findings since immunotherapeutics first came to the clinic is the discovery that many types of cancer can be treated effectively with the same agent. This provides more patients with more options and ultimately more hope and more life. We have especially seen this with the class of drugs called immune checkpoint inhibitors, which release the brakes from T cells so they can attack and eliminate cancer cells. Checkpoint inhibitors are among the most exciting approaches to cancer treatment that have entered the clinic. This is in part because some of the patients with metastatic disease who have been treated with these revolutionary treatments have had remarkable and durable responses, such as Dr. Al Sternberg did after he was treated with ipilimumab almost 10 years ago because he had advanced melanoma. Notably, when the first AACR Cancer Progress Report was published in 2011, only this drug, ipilimumab, had been approved, and only for the treatment of one type of cancer, metastatic melanoma. As of July 31st, 2020, there are 7 checkpoint inhibitors approved by the FDA, and 1 or more checkpoint inhibitors are approved for the treatment of 16 types of cancer, and are being used for the treatment of any type of solid tumor characterized by the presence of certain genetic characteristics, such as microsatellite instability, DNA mismatch repair deficiency, and high tumor mutation burden. These approvals are bringing hope to many patients, such as Leonard Gantz and Barbara Bigelow, who are featured in the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2020. While checkpoint inhibitors have yielded extraordinary benefits for patients with a diverse array of cancer types, not all patients respond to these immunotherapies, and some who respond initially develop resistance after a while. Therefore, an area of extensive research is to determine how to increase the number of patients who benefit from these life-saving immunotherapeutics. Researchers are approaching this issue in multiple innovative ways by developing new checkpoint inhibitors that target novel pathways in immune and cancer cells, by identifying cellular and molecular characteristics to select patients who have a higher likelihood of responding to the existing checkpoint inhibitors, and by identifying novel methods, including imaging techniques to monitor responses to checkpoint inhibitors. Researchers are looking to harness advances in genomic technology, not only to accelerate the pace of basic research, but also to improve patient care. Liquid biopsies are one of such technologies that's being studied for the use in many different ways in the clinic, such as highly sensitive monitoring for patient responses to therapies. Liquid biopsy refers to the collection and analysis of fluids from our body, such as blood, cerebrospinal fluid, or urine. Early detection of cancer is vitally important, and it's an area where liquid biopsies could make a major impact, because the earlier cancer is detected, the more likely it is that it can be treated successfully. There are still many questions to be answered and barriers to overcome if we are to realize the potential use of liquid biopsies. But this new research area holds enormous promise for increasing a number of cancers. Even though we have made many advances against cancer, much more work needs to be done. For example, it is estimated that more than 4 out of 10 cancer diagnoses among US adults aged 30 or older are attributable to potentially preventable causes, such as smoking, obesity, and alcohol. Moving forward, we also need to ensure that everyone benefits from groundbreaking advances that we make against cancer. No one is immune from cancer. It can strike anyone at any age, gender, race, or ethnicity, socioeconomic status, geographic location, and even political affiliation. And yet, sadly, we know that the advances highlighted in this report and the 9 that have come before it have not been accessible or benefit anyone equally. The stark reality is that certain segments of the population, including racial and ethnic minorities, continue to shoulder a disproportionate burden of cancer, and as you will hear shortly from Dr. Christopher Lee. We see this not only when cancer is detected and diagnosed, but we see it in uptake of cancer prevention and screening, and we see it in people who survive cancer. Unfortunately, racial and ethnic minorities have also been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 for many of the same reasons that they shoulder a disproportionate burden of cancer. This is unacceptable, and it is imperative that all stakeholders in the research community work together to more fully understand the reasons for health disparities and eliminate them. During this unprecedented time in our history, there is also a need for our nation's leaders to take on a much bigger role in confronting and combating the structural and systemic racism that contribute to health disparities. Renewed attention has been drawn to the issue of pervasive racism and social injustices in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the recent atrocities against people of color, including the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others. It is time for the scientific community to step up and partner with Congress to address this issue with the research community. In conclusion, as our report shows, medical research has and will continue to spur progress against cancer. The COVID-19 pandemic has created many challenges for cancer research, and while it is imperative that cancer researchers contribute to their unique expertise to combat the unprecedented global pandemic, we must not forget that there are many patients with cancer who are urgently awaiting more effective treatment options. To ensure that we can do this, we need to continue to prioritize medical research as a nation. A major goal of the Cancer Progress Report is to serve as a call for action to Congress and the administration, as well as to the public, to continue to make funding for medical research through the NIH a national priority. Ensuring that medical research remains a priority for our nation's policymakers is essential if we are to reestablish the momentum against cancer, fuel the economy, and help the United States to maintain its important position as the global leader in medical research. Therefore, the AACR urges Congress to continue to support robust, sustained, and predictable annual growth of the NIH budget, and to provide consistent and sufficient annual funding for the FDA and for the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC. These actions will guarantee that we continue on the path of making life-saving progress for all patients with cancer in the US and around the world. Thank you for your attention. Now, we are very grateful to Congresswoman Lucy McBath and Congressman Peter King for sharing their perspectives on cancer in the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2020. Please welcome Congressman Peter King.
I want to commend the American Association for Cancer Research on their annual report. There's been tremendous progress made in the war against cancer, but more research funding is needed. We have to support the NIH. We have to continue the research. My own family was struck by cancer. My mother had breast cancer. My father died from prostate cancer. My brother had leukemia, and my daughter had breast cancer. So these are all issues that I've personally seen, and I know the progress has been made. We got to stay on it. I'm committed. I'm leaving Congress this year, but I'll work with you as hard as I can to make sure we get the job done and cancer is defeated.
Now, I would like to introduce two distinguished members of the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2020 Steering Committee, Dr. Susan L. Cohen and Dr. Christopher Lee. Dr. Cohen is Chief of the Section of Pediatric Hematology Oncology and Stem Cell Transplantation. She's Director of Clinical Services and a Professor of Pediatrics in the University of Chicago. She is a leading authority on neuroblastoma, being a pediatric oncologist conducting phase 1 clinical trials of promising treatments for patients with relapsed disease. She is a prolific author. She has held numerous leadership positions, served on multiple medical boards, and has been awarded many times for her groundbreaking work. Dr. Lee is a professor in the Public Health Science Division and the Faculty Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. Dr. Lee specializes in identifying breast cancer risk factors. He co-leads Fred Hutch award-winning Cancer Registry and the Cancer Surveillance System database, which tracks cancer incidence and survival in 13 Washington counties, which is widely used by cancer researchers. Please welcome to both. First, Dr. Cohen will provide remarks, and then Dr. Lee. Dr. Cohen?
Thank you, Dr. Rebus. I'm pleased to speak to you today as we celebrate the release of the 10th annual AACR Progress Report. As you heard, remarkable progress is being made against cancer in the United States. During the past decade, there's been a steady reduction in the overall cancer mortality for adult patients diagnosed with cancer, and 5-year survival rates for children and adolescents with cancer in the United States has increased from 63% in the mid-1970s to 85% in 2016. Research on cancer genomics, including ambitious large-scale federally funded initiatives like the Cancer Genome Atlas Project, has fueled a revolution in our understanding of cancer development. These studies have led to the discovery of genetic errors or mutations that drive cancer initiation and progression. The seminal research has also led to the development of a new class of effective therapeutics that target the molecular changes that arise due to cancer-causing mutations. Because different types of cancer may harbor the same genetic alteration, new trial designs have been developed based on tumor genetics. For example, basket trials enable the testing of anti-cancer therapeutics that are matched with patients who have tumors with specific genetic alterations rather than specific tumor pathology. This trial design greatly enhances the efficiency of testing new, molecularly targeted therapeutics in patients with many types of cancer. Molecularly targeted therapeutics are being developed at an extraordinary pace and form the backbone of a powerful new approach to cancer treatment called precision medicine. During the 12 months covered in the report, the FDA approved 16 new molecularly targeted therapeutics. In addition, the FDA also expanded the use of 9 previously approved molecularly targeted therapeutics to include additional types of cancer. One of these therapeutics, entrectinib, was the second molecularly targeted therapeutic approved by the FDA to treat adult or pediatric patients with a type of cancer that harbors an NTRK fusion gene. Entrectinib penetrates the central nervous system, and remarkable responses in patients with brain tumors have been observed. Notably, in a recent clinical trial, entrectinib was shown to produce rapid and durable responses in children with high-grade brain tumors, as well as tumors that arise outside the brain that harbor NTRK or ROS1 fusions. These advances are bringing hope to patients and their families, such as Cammie Green and her parents, who will share their story with you shortly. Selumetinib is a therapeutic that targets the RAS-MAP kinase pathway. Abnormal activation of this pathway is seen in patients with the rare genetic disorder neurofibromatosis type 1, and it leads to the development of progressive benign and malignant tumors of the central and peripheral nervous system. Recently completed clinical trials have demonstrated that selumetinib results in sustained shrinkage of NF1-related plexiform neurofibromas and meaningful clinical benefit with an accepted safety profile. Based on the results of these seminal studies, selumetinib received FDA approval to treat patients with this debilitating, progressive, and often disfiguring rare disease that typically begins early in life. Despite the unprecedented progress highlighted in the report, cancer continues to be an ongoing challenge. One that is particularly of concern to me as a pediatric oncologist is that cancer remains the second leading cause of death among U.S. children ages 1 to 14, and an estimated 1,200 children are expected to die of cancer in 2020. It's also become clear that children who survive cancer often face unique health issues later in life. Additional research investigating the genetic factors associated with morbid late effects of treatment may provide insight for the development of personalizing surveillance strategies, as well as new interventions that will ultimately improve the outcome of survivors of pediatric cancer. In parallel with these scientific advances in cancer treatment, a number of recently enacted federal policies and programs are playing a key role in addressing the challenges faced by children with cancer and their families. A recent initiative that has received strong support from Congress is the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative. This initiative supports maximizing the use and sharing of data from children, adolescents, and young adults with cancer to accelerate advances in knowledge of the genetic and biologic underpinnings of these cancer, so that treatment can be improved and that we can increase the survival and quality of life of the approximately 16,000 children and adolescents diagnosed each year in the United States with cancer. Another policy aimed to drive progress against pediatric cancers is the Research to Accelerate Cures and Equity for Children's Act, or the RACE Act. The RACE Act requires that drug developers study targeted therapies that they are developing for adult populations in pediatric patients if the therapeutics act on molecular targets that are present in both pediatric and adult patients. Key provisions of the RACE Act were fully implemented just last month. The Childhood Cancer Survivorship, Treatment, Access, and Research Act, or STAR Act, was signed into law in June of 2018. And this is another piece of very important childhood cancer legislation passed by Congress in recent years. This legislation includes provisions to improve childhood cancer surveillance, enhance research on the late effects of childhood cancers, and increase research opportunities by expanding the collection of biospecimens for childhood cancer patients. The CDC has expanded support for childhood cancer surveillance in 10 states and is working to partner with more states to improve collection of this vital information. The Government Accountability Office is currently conducting an extensive report on barriers that impede access to care for childhood cancer survivors, and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality is developing national standards of care for childhood cancer survivors based on research of best practices. All of these efforts are critical to increasing our understanding of childhood cancers and the best way to support survivors as they transition to adulthood. Further progress will depend on Congress continuing to appropriate annual funding for the STAR Act implementation in accordance with the legislation. As I mentioned earlier, the AACR Cancer Progress Report is a cornerstone of the AACR's educational and advocacy efforts, highlighting how research continues to extend and improve lives. The message reflected through the many personal stories, some of which I've shared with you today, also underscore how unwavering bipartisan support from Congress in the form of robust and sustained annual increases in funding for the NIH, the NCI, and the FDA is vital if we are to accelerate the pace of progress against cancer for the benefit of patients and their families everywhere.
I want to start by talking about the progress that we have made with respect to cancer prevention and early detection. Through research over the past several decades, we have identified a number of factors that increase cancer risk. The big five are smoking, excess body weight, an unhealthy diet, sun exposure, and infection with certain pathogens, various viruses and bacteria. An estimated 40% of all cancers are caused by just these 5 preventable factors. So the more that we can do to avoid or reduce these exposures, the greater the impact we can have on reducing the burden of cancer. We also know that there would be other major health benefits to making these types of changes, as we know that things like not smoking and maintaining a healthy weight would also reduce risk of other common health problems like heart disease and diabetes. Let's talk a little bit more about smoking. While we generally think about smoking as being primarily related to lung cancer, what we now know is that smoking actually increases risk of 17 different types of cancer. Smoking has caused more than 5 million Americans to die of lung cancer since 1965. The good news is that smoking rates have declined steadily and are now at their lowest point in decades. This major success is the result of a multi-pronged approach to reducing smoking rates through things like education and policy changes. In fact, just last year in 2019, Congress raised the federal minimum age for the sale of tobacco products from age 18 to age 21. So we expect to see further declines in smoking rates throughout the United States. However, a new major challenge that we are facing is the rapid rise in the use of electronic or e-cigarettes, particularly among children and young adults. We still have a lot to learn about the health effects of vaping, but there is already growing evidence showing that in the short term, vaping can cause damage to the lungs. What we need is research on their long-term effects, particularly on their effects related to cancer. About 20% of new cancers are the result of a combination of excess body weight, diet, and being physically inactive. One thing that people can do to reduce their risk of cancer is be physically active. There is now data indicating that by being physically active, an individual can reduce their risk of 9 different types of cancer, including several of the common cancers, including breast, colon, and lung cancers. However, a major challenge that we continue to face as a nation is the sustained increase in rates of obesity. Now more than 40% of the U.S. adult population is obese. This proportion is estimated to increase to up to 50% in just the next 10 years. This rapid increase in obesity has fueled alarming increases in the incidence rates of a number of cancers that are related to obesity. So research on how the effects of obesity on cancer can be countered, along with new strategies to reduce obesity and curb this major epidemic, are of critical public health importance. One area that we continue to make progress in is in the early detection of cancer. We now have effective screening tests for several common cancers, including breast, cervical, colon, and lung cancers. The potential benefits of screening are the ability to identify and remove abnormalities before they become cancer, and to identify cancers early when they're small, before they have spread and grown to other parts of the bodies and are much more treatable. We continue to see important advances in the technologies and approaches used for cancer screening that have helped to limit their potential harms, things such as false positive and false negative results. It is important to continue efforts to ensure that all Americans have access to these screening tests, which are among our very best tools for reducing the burden of cancer. Lastly, I want to turn to the long-standing problem of cancer health disparities. We recognize that higher rates of new cancers and higher rates of cancer deaths are experienced by a number of different populations, particularly those that are medically underserved. These disparities date back to the very founding of our nation and persist to this day and are present along the full cancer continuum. We see disparities in education on cancer prevention, disparities in the availability and access to cancer screening tests, and disparities in the timely delivery of life-saving treatments for cancer patients. Let me give a few examples. African American children are 50% more likely to die of their cancer than white children. The death rate for stomach cancer is 2 times higher among Hispanics compared to non-Hispanics. Liver cancer patients with no health insurance live only half as long as liver cancer patients with health insurance. There are multiple complex reasons for these differences, but the majority of these factors are directly influenced by ongoing structural and systemic racism in our country. Therefore, in order to meaningfully address them, we need to continue to seek broad changes in institutional and governmental policies and practices. This year's AACR Cancer Progress Report includes many examples of the important role the federal government plays in educating the public about the benefits of proven cancer screening and early detection methods, protecting both kids and adults from the wide range of health hazards caused by tobacco, obesity, and other harmful exposures, and in identifying and implementing strategies to eliminate cancer health disparities. Therefore, as you continue to debate the FY 2021 Labor, Health and Human Services Education Appropriations Bill, we ask that you continue to show strong support for the critical public health programs that are funded by the NIH and the CDC that are helping us realize our common goal, which is to reduce the burden of cancer in the United States. Thank you very much for your attention.
My name is Al Stroberg. I am a retired orthopedic surgeon. I am now almost 72 years old. It starts back in 2005. I noticed a lump in my neck, and it turned out to be non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I was about 58 years old at that time, the same age as my paternal uncle, who also had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I was much luckier than he in that the modern treatment made it go away, and I was able to return to work and everything else. About 3 years later, another lymph node showed up. So we went back to his office to find out what the directions are. And he said, the good news, it's not lymphoma. The bad news, it's melanoma. We went ahead with a pretty large operation at UCLA Medical Center for removal of the original problem and examination of the lymph nodes. My surgeon said 23 out of 27 lymph nodes that were removed were positive. He had never seen anything that widespread already. After the radiation treatments, and this would have been the spring of 2010, it began first of the chemotherapies, interferon. It made no difference at all for the tumor and only produced nausea and basically flu-like symptoms. We stopped that in the fall of 2010, and the tumor continued to get wider spread and bigger. I lost about 40 pounds. I was very sick. I spent 18 to 19 hours a day in bed. Fluid buildup got in the way of breathing, and I developed night shortness of breath, resulting in having to go to the hospital a few times to have fluid drawn off my lungs so I could breathe. It had been more than a year since the original diagnosis, and it continued to get worse inexorably without stopping at all. And with so little hope on the horizon, we decided to ask our kids who were at school working on their graduate programs to come home and basically have the chance to say goodbye. In the January of 2011, my UCLA oncologist said there's a drug out there that may help. And it was in the spring of 2011, ipilimumab was released by the FDA. A few weeks later began treatments. Just around the second dose after that, around Father's Day of 2011, something changed. Two things we noticed was that the amount of fluid we could take off to the lungs every day started going down for the first time. And a large bump on my right shoulder, which was threatening to erupt because it was so tense, actually got dull and started to go down in size, something we could actually see. 2 days later, it was much better. And by the third injection, it was stopped taking the fluid off my lungs. I didn't have to do that anymore. A week and a half later, I'm getting better. I'm not going to die. How do you deal with that? Now you establish this other new bond and relationship with your kids that comes at a very high expense. And all of a sudden you get your money back, literally getting on with life. That was hugely memorable, a very big deal. But was able to go home after that. The next scan showed just what I felt. I was doing fine. I could sleep, I could walk, I could do everything else. And the only problem is that that special tube that they put in my lung, they had never taken one out because everyone who had it had died before. 3 doses and basically no other treatment since then. It's now been 9 years and there's no sign of disease. Let me say this about funding for continuing research. You keep on hearing about the aha moment when things will suddenly come together. That is rare. It really was a whole generation from the idea of a T-cell lymphocyte back there in the 60s to something that was actually therapeutically useful and saved my life. And if we don't make that investment, if we don't make those big efforts here and now, we're not going to see the benefits 10, 20, and 40 years from now. Our kids will not have the same benefit that I had from my parents' investment in the future.
Cammie was 4 when she was diagnosed with her brain tumors. She loved music and dancing. She was always dancing and singing. The ringleader of any group of children she was around, she was always in charge.
One evening 2 years ago,
we weren't sure if she was having a seizure or a stroke, or, we didn't know what was going on. So we called 911.
It was definitely an all hands on deck situation.
She'd just turned 4, and so she really didn't know what was going on. And so we're like, if we could just go ahead and do the MRI now, that would be great.
The message essentially was, we don't know what this is.
They had never seen anything like that before. 3 spots that had lit up. They were 3 separate tumors. At this point, we weren't sure it was cancerous. We met with geneticists, infectious disease, neurosurgery, neurology. We couldn't even keep up with who came into the room.
A new set of results would come back. Well, you know how we told you it was as bad as it can be? Well, that's before we knew this. Now it's really as bad as it could be. And that truly happened for, 2 weeks.
Her diagnosis was high-grade glioma.
Cammie had 3 to 6 months to live. Our head oncologist also told us that most loving families at this point would just go home and enjoy the time that they had.
And he kept saying that whatever you choose to do is the right choice.
So we traveled all over the country to different children's hospitals to seek advice from the best minds.
Doctors coming in and out, just answering questions, just brainstorming, what can we do? What are next steps?
The only place that really had any answer and option was in Florida. It was not what we hoped for. It started off with a brain surgery to debulk her tumors as best they could. Then it was going to be chemotherapy for multiple cycles, then radiation for 6 weeks. And then they were going to inject her stem cells for a total of 8 months. And they gave us a 10% chance.
And we were excited about that. It was the first time that someone had given us something that we could do to give our daughter a chance.
72 hours before that surgery, a test came back that showed that Camden had a very, very particular mutation in her tumors. And that was a miracle. It allowed some more information to get to researchers. And one of those researchers was Dr. Giles Robinson at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And he said for the first time in human history, they thought that they might have a medicine that could help Cammie with exactly what she had.
Her genetic testing showed that she had a ROS1 fusion, which entrectinib targets ROS1 fusions. And this meant that we would not be able to do the Florida clinical trial. It had to be a either or.
Luckily, the decision was very, very quick, especially once we heard what the treatment plan was. She would take 2 pills per day as her treatment. So we were there the next day.
I'll never forget when the research nurse, Tracy, came in and handed me a 3-year roadmap. And it had dates of dosing, blood tests, and MRIs. And I remember just looking at her and saying, 3 years? Like,
she must have given us something wrong.
Oh my gosh. It was amazing. It made me tear up just thinking about it. We were coming up on 3 months when the first MRI happened. 3 of her 5 tumors were completely gone.
Cammie's MRI images were all over these monitors. Dr. Robinson was pretty surprised. He used the word miracle.
She's been on the medication for 2 years. Those 2 other tumors, they've just stayed consistent for 2 years.
There's 2 side effects. One is weight gain, and the other one is brittle bones. We knew about Cammie's because she had bilateral femur fractures within just a handful of months. Cammie has been incredible throughout this entire journey. She is a fighter. There are countless people with stories just like ours. We would ask and be very grateful for the support and advocacy and funding going forward. This family has directly benefited from research, from funding clinical trials. We have seen every kind of person, and they all just want hope. Some way
path,
to keep going.
A path to help their child.
Good afternoon, wherever you are. We're going to be starting a panel discussion. This has been a moving event. And I want to start by asking Catherine Breen about Cammie and about thinking about Cammie, what would you advise other parents who are considering clinical trials for children? It is a very difficult area to do clinical trials, but your daughter is an example of success, of benefit from science. What would be your advice to other parents that went through, that are going through, but the thinking process that you went through?
Sure. Hello. We didn't have a lot of options. Clinical trials were really our only option forward, and we were grateful for something to do, truly. One bit of comfort that I could give another family is the doctors and researchers would not be doing the clinical trial if they didn't think that it was helpful or hopeful that it would work. And also, if it shows that it is not working, you're off the you go off the trial and you can try something else. It's not like you're on that trial and you have to stay on it for 3 years or 5 years. It's a flexible thing, and your doctor is working to help your child or you if you're the patient.
I think that's a very important message, that the clinical trial is a medical experiment that's very regulated and goes through a lot of levels of review, but it's not a contract. It's not that you sign there and you have to do something. It's that the patient and the caregivers have the decision making on what to do or not. Which brings me to my friend, Dr. Alstroberg. The drug that you received, ipilimumab, was just being on clinical trials. You were not eligible, I remember, because you had 2 cancers at the same time, something that excludes people from clinical trials, and you had to wait until it was approved. But can you tell us, since 2011, what has happened?
What has happened
with you? What happened with your treatment? I know it, but if you can share it with us.
I was going to say, this is a huge question. My kids got married, they got PhDs, they all like that, and I got to see a lot of things that were great weddings. But as far as my treatment, that's really boring. I haven't done anything. I keep on getting blood tests and CAT scans and PET scans and so on, and they're really boring. So I've stopped doing that even, because I just it's more of a problem than I think it's worthwhile just to go over and get a PET scan. So no, I'm over it. I consider that something that has gone and passed.
That's amazing, and that's the power of these therapies that turn on the immune system to fight cancer that can lead to long-term benefit. And I recall you telling me at one point, when you were responding, you said, I have a new problem. What do I do with the rest of my life? And you started sharing.
Well, yes, I for a while, I did go back to work, and I was really happy. But now, after all those problems, this reminds me, I don't know if I ever told you about a movie that I remember from a long time ago by W.C. Fields. I think it's called Gift. I mean, it was about this man, a storekeeper in Philadelphia, who's just had terrible, terrible things happen to him. But at the end of the movie, it turned out okay because he was sitting on a porch in an orange grove in California. And that's where I am right now. I'm sitting in no, I'm not on a porch, but I'm sitting in an orange grove in California, which is just about ideal. Thank you.
That's inspiring, Navo. I'm going to turn the conversation to Dr. Chris Lee. You talked about a healthy diet and physical activity to reduce cancer risk. Could you expand on how does this actually work?
Well, I mean, thank you. So this is still a very active area for research. So we do have some ideas of how physical activity reduces risk of certain types of cancers, but it's also something that needs more continued research. But some of the ways that physical activity can reduce cancer is that we know that physical activity can lower certain hormones and growth factors that we know are related to the development of certain types of cancer. We also know that physical activity can boost the immune system and also reduce inflammation, and that is related to a variety of different types of cancer. And then obviously physical activity can also, reduce body weight, reduce obesity, and obesity has its own set of risks for different types of cancers, such as, again, increasing inflammation, reducing immune function, and other sorts of effects. And so it's really multiple different things, multiple benefits that we see with respect to physical activity.
Thank you. And Dr. Sukhand, it was very moving to hear you talk about these target therapies that help CAMI and are helping other patients based on all of these studies that are now being, that are including in all patients with cancer, but in particular with pediatrics. What do you think are the most important scientific and policy priorities to continue to advance the treatment for children with cancer?
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. I mentioned a couple of them in my recorded remarks. I think there are a number of really important initiatives that have recently become instituted and are taking off. One of them is the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative, which will really, I think, give us an opportunity to mine pediatric data that's collected in large cohorts of patients, childhood cancers, as well as adolescents and young adults, which I think hopefully will lead to the identification of potentially new therapeutic targets that we can then test and conduct clinical trials to see if they can be as effective as the therapy that Cammie's received. The second initiative, which I think is really going to accelerate discoveries of new therapeutics, is the RACE Act that I mentioned. Many pharmaceutical companies very much are invested in taking care of adults with cancer and developing new therapies for adults, since it's a much larger population of cancer patients than pediatrics. But if indeed there's a therapeutic that's discovered using adult patients, and that particular target is present in pediatric cancers, this will enable us to also test these therapeutics in our pediatric patients, which will really accelerate the opportunities for pediatric patients to receive new therapeutics and for us to learn whether these therapeutics work in our population. And the last initiative I'd just like to discuss again is the STAR Act, which was initiated a few years ago. And this is really focused on developing better follow-up and treatments for survivors of pediatric cancer. We're very fortunate that we've made tremendous progress due to clinical trials largely over the last several decades, and we have many, many more survivors than we've ever had before. But we're beginning to really understand the toll that intensive chemotherapy and radiation has on our children who receive these therapies when they're young children. And so to be able to develop better therapies, interventions, surveillance for our survivors so that their quality of life is also improved will be incredibly important.
Thank you very much. Catherine, we've talked throughout this event that it's been the investment in science that has fostered the benefits for patients. Now we have an opportunity to talk to Congress with this briefing about where do they put money for continued investment in any areas. And could you convey your, as a mother of Cammie, what you think is the real impact of this investment in our lives, which is investment in science and medicine?
Sure. For us, it was just, Cammie has a rare cancer, and we've met many children with rare cancers, and there's no treatment option, and to be told, you may just want to enjoy the rest of your time with your child is heartbreaking, especially in Cammie's case. She seemed perfectly healthy. She had a seizure, and then all of a sudden we were told she had 3 months to live, 3 to 6 months to live. We're so grateful for the opportunity to have a way to just try to treat her at this point and hope for a future for her. Right. It's just to go on, to wake up one day and your healthy child you're told you have a short period of time. It was jarring, to say the least. And then to be told that there was no treatment. And then to get a call that we have a treatment that we think, that we're hopeful, cautiously optimistic will help your child. It was amazing. And I wish more parents could get that call. There's too many parents who don't get that call.
And that's a testament to going where you seek actively for options of treatment. You went to different places. You had the cancer tested genetically to see if there was a matching with the treatment, and it just came at the right time for Cammie. So that's an exciting story that attests to the power of science turning into patient treatment. And I know, Al, we've talked about this before, and you being a physician, being a patient of 2 cancers, you've researched, and I know how informed you were on the potential outcomes of having metastatic melanoma in 2010. But you talked in the video about the science that led to the new benefits. You met Dr. Jim Allison, who received the Nobel Prize for his thinking and preclinical work that has led to the development of immune checkpoint therapies that benefited you. I would like to hear from you what I know you've thought a lot about these and what you think this understanding of the immune system to treat cancer, how it has impacted the lives of many people.
I could say a lot of things, but about two ideas. One, if you had a chance to talk to Jim Ellison, you recognize what a wonderful, pleasant person he is. But also, he probably is not the cheerleader personality. And that's exactly why we need something like the AACR to be the cheerleaders and be the big announcers out there. He does what he does wonderfully, but that's not quite the whole package that we need. We need some help along the way. And to my personal insight is this: in medical school in 1973, something like that, I had a half-year laboratory work and worked with a fellow from UC Irvine who was doing brand new work on T cells and killer T cells in 1973. This is like relatively recent stuff when we went to like meetings that was like they talked about the difference between, and that was, what is that, 25, 45 years ago that it took to come up with that very small idea, that observation, and turn that T cell into something that really makes a difference. And so we have no idea what the finding is going to be this week or this year that's going to be paying off in 2040 and 2050. So we have to like invest that money, and that's not going to come from any place else other than basically our society. That's a great investment.
You're absolutely right, Al, on the fact that in the last 1 year that's covered by this cancer progress report from AACR, there have been 20 new drugs approved and expanding the indications for 15 other, 35 altogether. That's an unprecedented progress, and that's not by chance. That's because science is turning into treatments. Dr. Chris Lee, you talked about the disparities in access to care, and you are very active and a scholar of disparities, equity, and inclusion. And at the time with COVID-19, these disparities are even broader now. We're seeing that the same risk factors that lead to bad outcomes with cancer are also with COVID-19. How do you think we can continue to study and try to overcome these limitations? We all need to actively work on it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I also see a question in the chat around, what can Congress do? What sort of policy changes can be made to address a number of these longstanding disparities that I think are relevant, to COVID as well as to cancer. I think part of it starts with, providing access to healthcare. I think we have a number of ways of preventing cancer through, availability of screening tests and making sure that those screening tests are being delivered in an equitable way to all populations who, since we're all at risk of these common cancers, breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, cervical cancer, we have effective screening tests for all of these cancers that can detect them early and lead to great outcomes. I think another piece is, we know that vaccinations can be important. They'll be important for COVID once they're available. They're also important for cancer. If we think about the development of the human papillomavirus vaccine, that has the potential to essentially, nearly eradicate those cancers that are associated with HPV, such as cervical cancer. But we need to have, universal access to those types of vaccinations, as well as to COVID, the vaccine, when that's available to the populations that we know are most vulnerable and should be high priority for receiving vaccines. So I think there's a lot that can be done. Another policy piece is obviously legislation around smoking has had a major impact on reducing smoking rates, as I discussed, and I think continued efforts around these types of policy changes, which can have major public health impact in reducing the number of people who are smoking. So there's a number of things that I think we can do at the policy level in this space.
Thank you. Al, there's a question about your two cancers because at one point it seemed like your ipilimumab was being used to treat lymphoma, but it was, if you can make that record straight.
Okay. Yeah, that was a little confusing perhaps. Like I said, in 2005, I developed a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that was identified and treated with, which was then a new part, which was conventional chemotherapy plus rituximab, which is a specific monoclonal antibody for that, and it has been spectacularly effective for this, and essentially removed it. And that was the question. Like 4 years later, it looked like another bump that looked just like the lymphoma, except this wasn't a lymphoma bump, it was the melanoma that showed up. So those are completely different tumors, and they were treated quite differently.
And following up, there's a question about the use of another type of therapy for melanoma called tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, or TILs. And you were talking about your research on T cells in the 1970s, and TILs is a modern way of doing that. Do you want to comment further?
I'm not an expert in that. Okay.
TIL therapy is taking the immune system cells from the tumor, growing them up and giving them back to patients. Immune checkpoint blockade is the other form of immunotherapy, the one that helped Dr. Strobert, which is taking the brakes to those same TILs inside tumors. These are two ways to harness the power of the immune system to fight cancer. But now is being developed. It's become a fourth pillar of treatment of cancer, besides surgery, radiation therapy, and chemical therapies. All of them providing further improvements of patient care. There's another question for Dr. Lee. Much research has been done about exercise and diet as a risk reduction. Maybe it has been covered with what you said. I'm sorry, it disappeared for me. I think maybe we had just covered it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So in reference of health disparities, particularly low numbers of Blacks in clinical trials, is AACR considering trials looking exclusively at Black patients where cancer incidence is great in the population, like in prostate cancer? If you could answer on the general, I can touch about what AACR is doing.
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that this is a long-standing problem in terms of trying to have diverse representation of different populations in clinical trials. This is something that I think all scientists who are conducting clinical trials face in terms of how can we do better in terms of increasing enrollment of these different diverse populations. I think a number of our cancer centers that are funded by the National Cancer Institute have this as a mandate to really do more in community outreach and engagement to promote education and engagement around the potential benefits of clinical trial enrollment. So I think this is something that we still have a lot of work to do, but it's something that I think there's a lot more attention being paid to than there has been in the past.
And to expand, thank you very much for this great answer. At AACR, there's been a long-standing interest to study enrollment of patients in clinical research and expanding the benefits. We're working with several initiatives that are aimed at educating a new generation of more diverse clinical trialists that can open clinical trials in underserved areas where minority populations may not have access to clinical trials. With the COVID-19 pandemic, this may be actually a good thing coming out from a bad situation, which is the COVID has led to the implementation of telehealth, remote consenting for clinical trials that may allow to deliver drugs and enroll patients in clinical trials in more diverse populations. I have one last question that I'm going to ask Sukon about, which is, it says, there has been incredible progress in the past 10 years. Does anyone, and I'm asking you, like to predict how it could be on 2030 if we sustain the current research support levels?
So thank you again for the question. I'm incredibly optimistic about the future. If you take a look back at what's happened over the last just two decades in pediatric cancer, we've made tremendous progress. And I think part of that is because it's part of our culture in pediatric oncology to enroll patients on clinical trials. And I just wanted to comment a little bit about the racial disparities that have been identified by our medical oncology colleagues. We really don't see that as much in pediatrics. We actually have just recently reviewed some of our records, and it turns out that the numbers and prevalence of Black patient enrollments on many of our clinical trials and biology studies are very close to the patient population. And I think that by continuing to conduct these clinical trials, and it's all phases, not just for patients who have no other treatments and are on experimental phase 1 trials, but we capture a large proportion of patients who are treated on upfront phase 3 studies, testing new treatments, as well as early phase studies for patients who have new targeted potential opportunities for targeted therapeutics. As well as, I did want to comment, immunotherapy is also very promising in pediatrics. Checkpoint inhibitors that work so beautifully in many of the adult cancers don't work quite as well in pediatric cancers, but we do and have had remarkable responses to CAR T-cell therapy. We've completely revolutionized the way we treat patients who have leukemia and have tremendous success with CAR T-cells in leukemia, and T-cells are now being developed for solid tumors. And we also have had a lot of success using antibody therapy and antibody combined with chemotherapy, which we think modifies the immunosuppressive milieu of pediatric cancers, leading to better responses. So I'm very optimistic, and if these curves continue, we're currently cure about 80% of our patients. You know, I'm hopeful we're going to get close to that 100% mark in the next decade.
So that's really inspiring, and I agree with you. 80% is great. 100% is what we aspire to do, and that's what we should be doing. Working hard and continue to output our contribution to be able to do this. I'm going to thank you all. I'm going to thank Catherine Green and your husband for the inspiring story that you shared about Cami. We all wish her the best, and I'm sure you sharing her story helps other parents look for more options, and I hope they find the right options like you did for Cami. I want to thank Dr. Al Stroberg for sharing your story about 2 cancers being treated by molecularly targeted antibodies that are based on the scientific knowledge turning into life-saving therapies. I'm going to thank Sukon for all of this knowledge that you shared with us on how the investment in science can dramatically impact patients with pediatric cancers, and how the outlook is based on building on all of this success and improvements over the years. And I'm going to thank Chris Lee, your words about how the public policy affects cancer, how we're much better at preventing cancers and taking away risk factors and addressing structural issues in society that lead to limitation of access to care, in particular socioeconomic and racial disparities. We thank you very much for all of your work in this field. And I want to thank the AACR for putting this progress report together. It's the 10th year. It's an unprecedented year, but a year where we continue to look forward to the future. I want to thank the leadership of Dr. March Foti on allowing the society to be a place where we can share the progress and also call for action on what needs to be done. And also thank Dr. Raj Singh Gupta for being the main author of this progress report, working with all of the steering committee that I had the pleasure to be with Chris and Sue. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.